When we create or declare a variable, we as the programmer get to come up with or choose the name of that variable. Up to this point, I've showed you how you can use individual letters to be the name of a variable. Things like X, H, and Z. However, our programming language gives us some more interesting options to consider. In fact, we can use a word or even a phrase for the name of our variable. This is a good habit to get into as a programmer, where you use a word or phrase that describes the meaning of a variable, or also the purpose of how that variable is going to be used. From the perspective of our computer or programming language, it actually doesn't matter too much whether we use an individual letter or word or phrase. However, from the perspective of another programmer that has to read and understand your code, it's much more helpful to use a variable name that's informative. Let's go ahead then and look at what are our options when we're creating variables, what are the restrictions or limits that our programming language has, and also what are some best practices that many programmers use across different programming languages. When we choose the name of a variable in MATLAB, we have several different options to consider. Now it's true we could just use an individual letter for the name of our symbol and do things like X gets assigned 7, Z gets assigned 11, and then add these two things together to see that everything is behaving as we would anticipate. However, when we get to the point of writing more complex pieces of code, our code will be very difficult to read if we only use individual letters. Therefore, it's a best practice as a programmer to choose a name for a variable that's informative and describes the purpose of how this variable is going to be used. Our programming language will allow us then to name variables that are entire words or even phrases. As an example, I'll create a variable where the name is hours. It's a whole word. I'll assign it the value of 24. I could have another variable where the word is minutes, and that's the entire variable name. And I'll assign it the value of 60. Now when I go to write a command that uses these variables, you'll see that it's much more descriptive and informative about what's actually taking place when I go to execute this command. So you can see that everything is still working as we would anticipate. The value of the variables gets substituted in here for the name of the variables when we go to calculate the expression. Let me clear this off and say a few more things. Besides just using letters to form words for our variable names, MATLAB programming language will allow us to include numbers in particular ways in the name of our variables. So I could do signal 1 gets assigned the value of 88, and signal 2 gets assigned the value of 50. Now I can write a mathematical expression like signal 1 minus signal 2 and see the result. We get the value of 38. Keep in mind that the number that I'm using here for the variable name isn't actually a number that is used as part of the mathematical expression. Here, the 1 goes with the variable name. So I'm really just substituting 88 in here for signal 1. I'm substituting 50 in for signal 2 when I go to make that calculation. There is one restriction by our programming language about using numbers in variable names. It's unacceptable for us to name a variable that starts with a number. It must always start with a letter. So it's not allowed by MATLAB to create a variable like 1 signal. It must always start with a letter, and we can use the number at any other point along the way. I'll show you in a different video on error statements what would happen if we started to break some of these rules. What happens with MATLAB? Besides just using letters and numbers, let's consider using some symbols. So let's say I was going to create some other variable called dollars, and on the end, add the dollar sign. So you'll see that it turns red. This is indicating to us that something else is going on. Not really going to get into it in this video, but I'll talk about it at a later point. Same thing if we tried to substitute in like the number sign, turns red. The percent sign actually turns green because, again, something else is going on. And the ampersand sign. We already have meaning for the star and the exponent sign. It's unacceptable for us to use the @ sign in the name of a variable because it does, again, something entirely different. The exclamation point also has a different purpose. The one symbol that is worthwhile to consider is the underscore. So we could use the underscore here and form a phrase. Dollars, cents gets assigned 1.88. You can see that now we've created a variable that has a number 1.88 and assigned it to the variable of dollars underscore cents. Now, even though that this is allowable, it's actually discouraged and is not the best practice of engineers. If you're going to try and form a phrase, the better way to do this is to actually put it all together in one big long string of letters and do something like dollars, cents gets assigned 1.88. So it's better to not use the underscore and just use one long name of letters. It is also unacceptable in our programming language to use a space. So if we try and type this out and assume that we can create a variable here, we're going to have a problem. Something else is going on, and I'll show you in another video about what's happening there. In fact, the best way to go about using and naming a phrase, coming up with a variable with a phrase, is to use something called camel case. This is a special way of capitalizing the words that are part of a variable name. So the rule of thumb is that lots of programmers use across many programming languages is to use a lowercase letter for the first word and use an uppercase letter for all the other words. This will make your code much easier to read. So if you have the option between creating a phrase, these three things here, the best one to use, by lots of programmers will agree to this, is to use what's called camel case, where you keep the lowercase letter here for the first word and uppercase for all the other words. So if we had a variable like number of samples, here I've put together three words. My first word is lowercase, then my other ones, second and third one, are all going to be uppercase. So I could do something like this. That concludes what I wanted to say about the naming conventions. You have lots of different options to choose from. Really, if you're going to select one, make sure that it's informative and descriptive, and then follow these rules, whether you're putting together a word with numbers or even a phrase that's made up of multiple words.